Okay, welcome everybody to the latest talk in our series on religion and astrobiology. Joining me today, we have Benjamin E. Zeller, who's a researcher and teacher of religion in the States. Yes, in the States. Yes, in the States. He focuses on religious currents that are new or alternative, including new religions, the religious engagement with science, the quasi-religious relationships people have with food. His interests are united by an interest in expanding the conversation about religion by including less commonly studied groups, phenomena, and topics, and looking at more common topics, such as religion and science, American religious history, from new angles. He's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Religion at Lake Forest College, private liberal arts college in the Chicago suburbs. He previously served as director of the college honors program, assistant professor of religious studies, and coordinator of the religion and philosophy major at Brevard College, and visiting Fulbright fellow at Abo Academy in Finland. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. I think, unless there's anything else anybody wants to add, I think over to you for a fascinating talk on UFO religions.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Since we do have a transatlantic connection, if I lag or I need to repeat myself, let me know. I know that during the intro, there was a bit of a blip. I heard you eventually, but you got slow and fast. So if I blip, just wave and I'll start over. I don't want you to miss what I'm saying.
No problem.
So great. Well, thanks again for having me. So, a lot of the impetus for what I'm going to talk about today comes from the Brill Handbook of UFO Religions, which I edited and came out last year. Anyone who knows Brill's publishing model knows that their books are prohibitively expensive for an everyday person to purchase, but hopefully you can all access it through your, if you have access to a university college library or even a public library, they could order a copy. But I'm building on the work that that my colleagues did in contributing to that book, which I edited. And the impetus for that book, the Brill Handbook of UFO Religions, was that the scholarship we had on UFO religions, and I'll talk more about what that means in a few minutes, was pretty dated. There's a couple of good books that came out over a decade ago. Chris Partridge had a good collection. Jim Lewis had a good collection. And then there's sort of some scattered articles here and there. But I really wanted to see what the current directions in the field were. So I emailed all of the people I knew who worked on new religions, UFO religions, and we sort of tried to put together a little research group. And this was during the pandemic, so we never actually met, but we all contributed papers, and that's what the handbook came out of. So I do have a little PowerPoint slide show, which I'll share with you, mostly so I don't lose track of what I am talking about or trying to. Let's play, here we go. All right, so I want to start with noting that there's no clear consensus on what actually UFO religion is. And this is something that came up as I was editing the handbook. So for example, I was emailing with Hugh Urban, who works on Scientology. And I said to Hugh, Hugh, would you read a chapter from my book on Scientology? And he said, well, I don't think Scientology is a UFO religion. And I said, well, how come? I mean, there's a UFO ideas are central to their sort of their mythic story and their origin story. If you know Scientology, the story of how people came to Earth is that we're basically the descendants of these spiritual beings, for lack of these souls, for lack of a better word, thetans, which come from outer space on UFOs, or actually they're not unidentified. They're quite identified. They're 747 like flying vessels from outer space. So I said to Hugh, I said, I mean, there's flying saucers basically in their religion. We should count that. And he said, well, it's not really central to what they do. And I said, okay, that's fine. Let's put it anyways. But now you know how you're going to start your chapter. And there were other conversations like that as well. So for example, Nation of Islam is another one. Where Nation of Islam, UFOs are central to their story. And if you know the story of Mexico City, and sort of this image of sort of the mother wheel descends and then communicates with the founder. But indeed, their practice doesn't really center on UFOs. If you ask an everyday member, either a Scientologist or a member of Nation of Islam, do you think about UFOs? The answer is probably no. So where do you draw the line? Is it if it's part of the mythology of the worldview, but not part of their central beliefs and practices? For the handbook, I included all of them. For today, I thought I'd talk more about the ones where UFOs are more central. But the definition of what we're going to count is pretty pretty hazy here. Also, even what counts as a UFO is somewhat hazy. So the way I often sort of end up defining the categories, thinking about the examples. This is, if anyone knows philosophy, this is, Wittgenstein's way of how you define something. It's a family resemblance. So I know 10 or 15 things which I want to count as UFO religions. So I'm going to make a definition based on the groups I want to consider. That's sort of post hoc, but and then I can know if I want to include some new groups as well. I mean, the classic examples that are included in UFO religions, and I'll talk about a few of them here, are groups like Unarius and Aetherius, Ashtar Command, Chen Dao, which is a Chinese group, but also which spread to North America, Solar Temple, Heaven's Gate, the United Nubian Nation of Moors are interesting. Again, they're an African-American group with UFOs as part of their ideology, but not really central to their practice. The Raelians. But there's lots of groups we can think about. So that's what we'll talk about. The UFO itself, however, understood is central to these groups. And sometimes the UFO literally means something in the sky which they don't know what it is. Oftentimes it's something more like a flying saucer, and sometimes it is the beings on whatever that vehicle is, but it's the beings that matter and not so much the way they got here. So some of the UFO religions might be better understood as extraterrestrial religions, outer space religions, in that they refer to the beings as opposed to the vessel which brings them here. UFO religion is the old term. It's been around since the 70s or 80s, so I keep using it. But actually, I just wrote a chapter for a book on religion in outer space, and I wrote on outer space religions, and I said it's basically the same thing as a UFO religion, because a lot of the UFO religions aren't interested actually in the ship itself. So people who know my work know that my main book is on Heaven's Gate. So Heaven's Gate was famous for the 1997 mass suicides in San Diego, where all the active members killed themselves to go onto the flying saucer, which they thought was following Hale-Bopp comet. And when I've interviewed ex-members, one of the things that many of them have said to me, actually all of them said to me, is it's not really about the flying saucer. It's about the beings on that saucer and where we're going. So that's a common idea too. All right. So, by the way, this fun illustration is from an old science magazine from the 70s, imagining UFOs from the 1970s, maybe the 60s actually. All right. So, how can we characterize all of these groups, which I'm going to call UFO religions? We'll talk about some examples in a bit, but basically, these are all post Kenneth Arnold 1947 groups. When we talk about UFO religions pre-1947, we don't even have the term, because of course that's a post-Arnold term. We can talk about Swedenborgians, who had sort of these astral journeys to other planets. We could talk about Theosophists and spiritualists who sometimes communed with Venetians or Martians or beings from other planetary systems. But really the birth of the UFO religion as we know it is post Kenneth Arnold, and I'm guessing pretty much everyone here knows that the story of Kenneth Arnold, but if not, this was the sighting of the first flying saucers. Didn't actually say that, but that's the newspaper headline called them flying saucers. So that's where we get our flying saucer story from. He was an amateur pilot who he saw these UFOs. But the term UFO or flying saucer really comes up post 47. Of course, it's not on the slide here, but one thing we can think about too is sort of the context of the Cold War, and this is post nuclear bomb. So this is the atomic age. So all of this is sort of in the air, and in fact, many of the initial UFO religions are responding directly to Cold War tensions and to fears about the atomic age, which we'll talk about in a bit. Most UFO religions are interested in what I would call alternative archaeology and alternative scientific claims. Sometimes they explicitly embrace the alternative archaeological claims about ancient aliens or ancient astronauts, claims like aliens built the pyramids and things like that. Other times it's not so much archaeology, but various quasi-scientific claims. What's interesting is that for UFO religions, they almost always claim that they are scientific, they are technological, in a way that many other religions do not necessarily center. Many UFO religions are drawing from an esotericist background. This is a Western esotericism, can mean everything from sort of formal magical systems like tarot and things like that, to channeling, the idea, claim that you can speak for a being from beyond. There's a sort of a broad overlap between UFO religions and the groups we consider new religious movements or alternative religions, esotericist religions, New Age religions. Finally, and I'm borrowing this term directly from Michael Barkin, all UFO religions rely on what's called stigmatized knowledge. So these are claims that are broadly considered irregular, if not deviant by broader society. They often are conspiracist in orientation. They don't have to be, but they claim as central to UFO religions ideas which are not considered central by those outside. Now, there's a bit of sort of historicism to this, because of course, what ideas count as deviant and not changes over time. And the claim in the 1950s or 1960s to take UFOs seriously is very different from a claim in 1980s, 1990s, or today. So this changes over time. But regardless of what era we're talking about, their central beliefs don't fit into the mainstream, is one of the commonalities. So, all right, so here's what I thought we'd do with the rest of our time, is I'd talk about some typologies of how we can categorize UFO religions, give you some examples, and then we can talk. The first typology I thought I would offer you is based on effectively how the UFO religion got started and how the founder or founders got connected to a UFO or the beings inside the UFO. There's basically three types here, and there's a bit of overlap. So think of this as like Weberian ideal types here. The first is the contactee or abductee. So this is the founder or founders who claims they've directly encountered a extraterrestrial or a UFO, and that they have learned something from that, and that they bring that knowledge to the world, and that is the impetus for the founding of a UFO religion. These are almost always contactees. Sometimes they're abductees. So the case of actually Rael, the founder of Raelianism, is interesting. He claims originally to be he claims originally to be a contactee, then an abductee, then a contactee. He sort of goes back and forth. At one point he says, yeah, they kidnapped me, but they kidnapped me and then they took me to their space brothel, basically. So I was okay with it. So he goes back and forth whether it was willing or not. But usually these are willing. There are some counterexamples of people who really do claim to be abducted by space aliens, and new religions come out of those. Often those are groups which are very negative in orientation towards the extraterrestrial, if there's an abductee experience. So the Alien Resistance Headquarters is probably a good example of that. That's a Christian evangelical UFO religion. Not the founder, but some of the members claim that they had been abducted, and that the aliens are demonic, and that their group is about opposing space aliens because space aliens are seen as demonic. Most contactees, though, have a positive message. The other sort of major type of UFO religion is what I call neo-theosophical. And always when I say this, I think of my colleague, Kathy Wessinger, who works in theosophy, who would remind me to remind you that the original theosophy of Blavatsky and Olcott, when it referred to its masters, and if you know the story of sort of theosophy, it's the knowledge comes from the masters, what later get called the ascended masters. The original ones for theosophy, like 120 years ago, were living people up in the Himalayas. They were Moses and Jesus, who were sort of still alive, or they were, their descendants, these Tibetan masters. And very occasionally, Blavatsky said you could have sort of them on other planets, or they could be in spiritual form, but the ones she talked to were basically living people. That gets morphed really through the Guy Ballard's I Am movement in the 20th century, where the masters become space aliens. And the ascended masters are seen as beings from outer space. But the theosophical movements claim not direct contact, but incidental contact, either telepathic or spiritual, or from a message or an object which has been sent to them. But rather than the individual going onto a UFO or talking face to face with the space alien, an idea is sent to them from the extraterrestrial or from outer space or from a UFO. And this idea becomes the center of the new religion. And this is what I'm calling neo-theosophical. The third are UFO religions, religious movements, which come out of the alternative archaeology, ancient alien, ancient astronaut world. And those, by and large, people who claim to have deduced that there is alien presence on Earth. So they didn't talk to an alien, didn't get a message from an alien, but they figured out the aliens are amongst us and that there's some sort of religious connection. There's very few formal movements that are like this, but there's a lot of people. People often involved sort of deeply in New Age movements who claim, yes, that aliens built the pyramids or aliens built the Stonehenge, and this is part of their spiritual religious practices, but they don't claim to have ever seen one or gotten on board a UFO. Again, there's very few formal movements like this, but there's a bunch of people who would make these claims. So we're going to call that a new religious movement in a broad sense, but not an organization. All right, so what are some examples of these? And I'm looking at time and realizing I said I'd talk for like half an hour, so I have like 15 minutes left, but that's okay. I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I'm thinking about here.
It's not a strict timeline.
Okay, good. I'll keep going then. Give me my coffee. The contactee type is quite interesting because I really read it as an evolution of the older sort of Swedenborgian spiritual tradition. So the Swedenborgian model called for, and this is the Church of New Jerusalem, this is Emanuel Swedenborg's movement, called for sort of astral journeys to other planets. And Swedenborg writes about sort of, he had this sort of visions of traveling, sending his consciousness out beyond the earth. And then Swedenborgians sort of try to mimic this in their experiences, but we call that either astral travel or channeling or mystical visions, which involve the extraterrestrial in some way. But again, almost never an interest in the vessel which they might be traveling on. So these are really extraterrestrial or outer space religions, pre-Kenneth Arnold, post flying saucers, post 47, post UFOs. The first really big example of the contactee type would be George Adamski's movement, which the movement fizzled, but Adamski became very, very influential. He was a contactee who claimed to have both seen a UFO and then eventually interacted with the beings on board the UFO, the flying saucer, who he called Space Brothers. And these are the very Nordic-looking, sort of tall, fair space aliens, very human-like. And these Space Brothers, as he called them, and he's several times interacted with them. They actually left him some evidence at one point, sort of a plate of some sort, which then they take back. It's very similar, actually, to Joseph Smith. But they warned of nuclear war. So it's clearly an atomic age civil war. Atomic age Cold War, Civil War, Cold War style new religious movements, where they're responding to what would the advent, the dawn of the nuclear age. And the Space Brothers warn Adamski that if humanity doesn't get themselves into shape, we're going to destroy ourselves, and that's a problem. If you've seen I'm blanking on the name of the classic 1940s or 50s film, is it with the Klaatu and such. I mean, it's basically the same basic idea. I'm blanking on the name of that film, but they come here to warn us that we're going to.
The day the Earth stood still.
Yeah, thank you. The day the Earth stood still. It's basically a religious version of the day the Earth stood still. Thank you for that. The religious connection here is also the Space Brothers. They claim that they brought the same message to Jesus about sort of how to uplift humanity and keep humanity from destroying ourselves, and that they offer sort of a spiritual vision for how humanity can rise above our current sort of scientific technological crisis. So it's not just scientific, it's a spiritual warning as well. The Space Brothers don't say we have to give up atomic energy, which rather the atomic weaponry. So there's sort of a technology is still central here, and they sort of call for humanity to rise up and become like them. Adamski's movement actually fizzles. He founds a sort of a small UFO religion. It doesn't actually ever gain more than a dozen members or so at most. It mostly is a mail order group. And then he's successful with his publishing career, and he has a series of sort of epistolary interactions with other sort of contactees, but it never survives as a movement. But there are other sort of Adamski style movements that pop up. The founder, the best example I can think of the neo-theosophical type, which is the second type. And again, we're getting sort of old, but I'll I'll get to the present day in a bit, is the Aetherius Society. And I wanted to mention this because I know some of you are UK based, and you can actually go visit their sites. They still have, they're still around, and they still have a couple of sites that are active. George King was their founder. King is interesting because he was a channeler. Even before he channeled space aliens, he channeled spiritual beings. So this is a individual who didn't claim ever to sort of get onto a UFO, but rather that the extraterrestrials contacted him and that they spoke through him, in this case as a channel. He was interested in metaphysics. He was interested in yoga. He was interested, like many theosophists, in sort of looking to Asian religions. And he had, he talked about questions about sort of reincarnation and things like that. But like other theosophists, he tried to sort of bring all religions together, and he added to that then the extraterrestrial. In the case of King, it's not the Space Brothers, but the Cosmic Masters. These are beings, again, they include the same figures. The Buddha, Jesus, people like that are all Cosmic Masters. Aetherius was one of the Cosmic Masters as well. They're primarily from Venus and Mars. King uses the term Great White Brotherhood, which is actually drawn from the esotericist tradition. So that's sort of a group of sort of spiritual adepts that help guide humanity. So the Cosmic Masters or Great White Brotherhood are spiritual beings here to help us. Unlike the Adamski style sort of fear of nuclear weaponry, there's much more positive millennial outlook here. There is a bit of fear as well. So King does warn, or rather Aetherius does warn King to warn us about the dangers of nuclear weapons, but it's much more very a positive idea of sort of humanity can raise our sort of energetic levels, and we can evolve into a higher spiritual consciousness, and they'll teach us how. Mikhail Rothstein, who wrote the chapter for the Handbook of UFO Religions, did a great study of their use of ritual. Aetherius has a very well-defined religious rituals by which they aim to sort of raise humanity's energetic level so we can become closer to sort of this extraterrestrial ideal, and we can create what King calls a new millennium. Which is this new time of technological scientific success and advent, where we're going to solve all of our diseases and our problems of the world, environmental, nuclear problems, and we will heal the planet and heal humanity. So the aliens are here to tell us how we can sort of fix ourselves. That's very typical for the neo-theosophical sort of model. So they're here to help us. And of course, that falls in line with what original theosophy did 120 years ago, which is that these spiritual beings are here to help us evolve into higher spiritual beings. There's no real movement, as I said, about alternative archaeological type. Those of you who know internet memes will, of course, recognize the image on the right. But there are folks who read sort of the popularizers of what the ancient alien, ancient astronaut claims, or they, even if they don't read it, they watch it on the History Channel, which is if you don't know the History Channel, like where you are in the US, the History Channel is very big, and it originally, I think at one point it was actual documentaries. Now it's mostly about space aliens and things like that. But it's those who either read or imbue this through pop culture, often integrated into their religious practices. This is basically found within the New Age, what we used to call the New Age. Most New Agers don't call themselves that anymore. There are some exceptions, but people who are into this tend not to join a particular movement. If you're familiar with sociology of American religion, you've probably heard of the word the nones. N-O-N-E-S. These are people who don't affiliate with the religious tradition. This number has been rising rapidly. It was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, it was a fifth of the American population. Now it's higher. Often they're people who are very spiritual, but they just refuse to join a group, and they're very eclectic. And the place of the alien or the extraterrestrial or the UFO, as read through alternative archaeology, and claims that everything from the Nazca lines to the actually in North America, there's a lot of claims about the mounds, that the North American, the mounds are evidence of various Native American groups communicating with space aliens. These become central to their religious practices and beliefs. So they might go, for example, on pilgrimage to Chichen Itza or to Teotihuacan, to the pyramid in Mexico City, to sort of raise their vibratory levels, their energetic levels. But the reason they think those are sacred places are because the aliens built it or helped people build it. So there's the alien or the extraterrestrial are central to their religious, spiritual outlook. But again, you're not going to find movements based on this. Organizations. You will find all sorts of like advertisements and books and websites and people talking about this, but you're not going to find sort of a formal religion because these people don't tend to join formal religious groups. Nevertheless, it's very prevalent. I'll give a tangent here. I just started a research project looking at a small UFO religion called Unicult. And I think some of the members of Unicult or I know some of the members of Unicult make these claims, even though it's not a formal part of the religious teachings of the group whatsoever. The group makes no claims about this, but people who are drawn into it talk about this, and it is a lot of intersections to broader New Age. All right, so let me offer another typology. This overlays on the previous one. The way we can think about UFO religions is not just where the founder got their ideas or the adherents, but what the basic message is. A lot of UFO religions are basically claiming to interpret scripture through the lens of the UFO or broader ufology. And most of these in the West are biblical. There are, of course, Asian equivalents. So in Japan, for example, there are those who would claim to be reading the Lotus Sutra through the lens of ufology. I am trained in Western religious traditions, so the examples I can think of are from over here. But I do know from, for example, Franz Winter and others who've worked on the Asian context, and there's quite a few Korean, Japanese, and even Chinese UFO religions that are looking at primarily Buddhist scriptures through the lens of the UFO. But again, I don't happen to know those, so I'm not going to talk about them. You also have UFO religions, which are basically the basic message is about self-transformation. I would call these New Age ones. It's about you, the practitioner, how you can either heal yourself or overcome your trauma or raise yourself to a higher consciousness or achieve bliss or salvation. It's usually very this worldly, but occasionally it could be otherworldly as well. It could be a good reincarnation or something like that. Finally, there are UFO religions, which are basically world transformative. These are utopian or millennial. So I'll use again my colleague Kathy Wessinger's model of catastrophic or progressive millennialism. Progressive millennialism is utopianism. We will progress towards a better millennium. Things will be better. We'll live in sort of the utopian future. Catastrophic millennialism is what we tend to call apocalypticism, sort of the end of the world as we know it, destructive. I don't want to get deep into Christian theology when I understand probably the theologians here, so we could talk about where the millennium, of course, comes from the Book of Revelation, and then it gets morphed in popular culture. But as an academic term, we're thinking about end time beliefs here. So again, there's all sorts of different examples we can give. Most of my initial research has been on Heaven's Gate, which is a group which basically tried to reinterpret the Christian Bible through the lens of the UFO and ufology. It's interesting in this tangent, but when it comes to ufology, which is sort of the subculture of people who are interested in the study of UFOs, very few members of UFO religions are deep into ufology. That means they don't go to the conferences. They don't subscribe to MUFON. They're not sort of the scientific ufologist type, but they draw from ideas which sort of were popularized among those who have a more sort of scientific interest in the UFO. Those interested in this could read Brenda Densler's wonderful book on the intersections between religion and ufology as sort of a secular field of interest and study. Heaven's Gate's a good example. Actually, Applewhite and Nettles are basically looking at the Christian Bible, but they get into prophecy and they get into sort of astrology and into channeling, and then they read a bunch of ufology and they sort of morph it all together. They were always interested in UFOs, but they come to interpret basically themselves and their movement as fulfilling Christian prophecy, and they then read back the Christian Bible through the lens of the UFO. And for example, when they talk about any sort of miracle from the Bible, this is simply extraterrestrial technology. Whenever the Bible talks about a cloud of light or Ezekiel's chariot or things like that, these are all sort of just extraterrestrial technology. So there's others who make the same claim, but they're sort of an example of this. What's interesting about Heaven's Gate is they overlap with that third category as well. They come to be very, very millennial in orientation. Initially, they're more in that second category as well of this typology. It's about self-transformation. They shift over time to the third. Again, think of these as Weberian ideal types. So any particular actual historical movement is going to shift around over time over where it is within these categories. But basically, Heaven's Gate is, as I see it, is a biblical religion. There are, I've met a few Hindu UFO adherents who read the Rig Veda and the Mahabharata as describing interaction with space aliens. And of course, Hinduism is built into it as already the recognition of life on other planets as well. That's part of sort of the loco, that the spheres are filled with life. So, but I do know some sort of Hindu folks who would make similar claims about the Hindu text, but this is a Christian text. Heaven's Gate, of course, ends in the suicide. They decide eventually that, like the early Christian martyrs, they had to demonstrate to the world the significance of their beliefs, and that they were going to show how serious they were, and they were going to give up their lives for their beliefs, in the hopes that others would be convinced of the truth of them. Of course, Heaven's Gate did not do that, because we did not all become Heaven's Gators, but that was their hope, that the suicides would sort of galvanize the rest of us into taking this seriously and recognizing how true it was. Of course, that did not turn out. Unarius is a great example of the sort of the New Age type. This is mostly defunct by this point. There are still some members of the Unarius Academy of Science in California, but Ruth Norman, who's pictured in this image, and Ernest Norman are the founders. Like Adamski, they communicate with the Space Brothers. Like Aetherius, healing rituals are central to this group as well. And if you actually look at how Unarius functioned, although the claim that the Normans have is that they're communicating with space aliens. And if you read their initial texts, I think Ernest Norman's book, one of them is called Interdimensional Physics, I think. And so it's very scientific, very sort of technological sounding. And they claim the space aliens are going to build sort of hospitals, and they're going to build power plants. So it's sort of a technological utopian vision. In actual practice, members of the Unarius Academy of Science engage in sort of these healing rituals by which they aim to overcome personal traumas in their lives and elevate their consciousness to sort of a happier state of being. So although the ideology is heavily based on UFOs are going to come and solve the world's problems, in fact, the way that members actually practice this religion is they go through these practices meant to help the individual go from a state of unhappiness to happiness. One might argue that's how all religions work anyways, but at least in this case, although the space alien and the UFO and the flying saucer are central to the ideology, and the Normans were famous for, you can sort of see it in my image there, this car they had built a flying saucer onto, and they would drive around California. In actual practice for members of the society, this was, although they did believe in all these things, the actual practices were much more about sort of transforming the self into a happier person. The millennial type is a good example of that is the Raelian Church. And of all the religions we've talked about, this is one of the few which is really active today in any meaningful sense. The founder, Rael, Claude Vorlhan, is, as I said earlier, contactee, abductee, goes back and forth in his claims whether he was willing or not. But like the founders of Heaven's Gate, he wants to reinterpret the Bible. So the space aliens for him are not the Space Brothers, not the Great White Brotherhood, but the Elohim. So whenever the Bible talks about the Elohim, and again, I don't want to get too far into, in this case, biblical criticism, but the Old Testament, the Christian Bible, I'm sorry, the Jewish Bible, the Torah has different words for God. And one of the words for God is the Elohim, which is grammatically plural, even though it's singular in the way it's used in the text. But he takes it literally as a plural, referring to these beings, the Elohim. So whenever the Bible talks about Elohim, which a Jew or a Christian would say that means God, he says, well, that's actually these space aliens. And you can see, because it's plural. So the Elohim, these space aliens come and they talk to the Israelites and they try to guide the Israelites, and the Israelites are too stupid to realize these are actually space aliens. And they worship them as gods. This is sort of the, this is like von Däniken style chariots to the gods in some ways. It's sort of, the ancients were so primitive, they, they record it, but they're not, they never actually said, hey, it's space aliens. They just drew a picture of, a guy with a spacesuit. But the claim that Rael has is that if you delve into the Bible, you will see that actually it's about space aliens, and that the Elohim have continued to interact with humanity since that time, and that if we simply heed their message, we will achieve a millennial transformation of our planet. This is what Wessinger calls avertive millennialism. So your classic forms of millennialism are premillennial or postmillennial, if you want to use Christian theological concepts, and then those get sort of tracked onto progressive or catastrophic millennial. That is, we will progress towards the kingdom. That's progressive millennial, and then the kingdom will come and it will be destructive. That's catastrophic. The third form of millennialism is avertive. We can stop the apocalypse. A bad thing is coming, but we can fix it. And then that bleeds over into a progressive vision. If we simply welcome the Elohim, and then in the case of the aliens, that means we need to build them an embassy in Jerusalem. If we simply build an embassy for the Elohim in Jerusalem, then they will land. We will prevent all the bad stuff which is going to happen, and instead we will allow this new millennial dawn to come. So it's about transformation of the world. They support what they consider efforts to make the world a better place. This includes everything from work against genital mutilation, female genital mutilation, to supporting safe sex and body positivity, to environmental causes. So they see themselves as deeply involved in trying to make the world a better place in preparation for the Elohim arriving. So what can we say to wrap this all up? I've tried to give you a couple of different typologies of new religious movements with UFO connections, what we're calling UFO religions. They're almost all millennial. Nearly every one of them has a millennial vision as central. They're all post-1947. They are all children of the atomic age, where people with fingers on buttons that can blow us all up. And I don't think it's surprising that every one of these groups has basically a catastrophic or avertive model. There are some that basically ignore all of that and just say focus on the individual. But even those, they tend to claim that perhaps what initially attracted the attention of the space aliens is that humanity had become a nuclear power. So there's sort of a nuclear atomic Cold War style sort of fears of destruction. When I gave this talk maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I remember the audience saying, well, what about now? Now we live in a safe world. We don't have, we don't have global superpowers. We don't have, that anymore. And obviously in 2022, that's we're back to the fear of Rogue could push the button and we could have the end of the world. So we have sort of this millennialism central. Nearly every UFO religion has a physicalist model of salvation. You could say materialist as well, if you mean that in the philosophical sense, not like as in like getting money, but materialist or physicalist as in the body. Nearly every one of them, it's about either happiness, contentment, salvation, perfection comes in this body on this planet, or in another body on another planet, but it's physical, it's material. If it is ethereal or astral in some way, it's understood in a scientific way. Maybe that salvation does not mean you're going to have a physical body, but it can be explained through science. So there's a physicalist sort of, from an ontological level, it is basically materialistic from a philosophical standpoint. Or sometimes this is, reincarnation based, but then there's a claim that it's, and again, this can be proven scientifically. There's sort of a scientific physicalist side to this. UFO religions are very contemporary. The space aliens seem quite attuned to what's going on our planet. In some ways, UFO religions, you can track the ones being founded decade by decade and see what are they interested in, and it makes sense that's what we see. So the initial UFO religions very much tied to nuclear concerns. Then during the 70s, you have UFO contactees making claims about environmental problems. This is during the era of 3 Mile Island and things like that. So you have sort of environmental concerns about we're going to destroy our planet. Then you have a lot of engagement with popular culture. It's fascinating that, for example, while it's claimed that the Roswell crash happened, decades earlier, the UFO religions don't really talk about it until that was part of public consciousness, which was not until the 70s or 80s. So even though, of course, you'd think perhaps they would have mentioned, 20 years earlier, oh yeah, some of our friends crashed over there. It's only mentioned once people know about Roswell, which is a post-70s sort of phenomenon. So they're very presentist in a certain way. If you're not a member, of course, this makes sense. But if for the members, they have to make sense of this. It's sort of the UFOs and the aliens sort of responding to what's going on in our popular consciousness. And so I'll end with this, which is some people think, I was sitting on a plane the other day. I was flying somewhere, and someone said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a professor. I study." And they said, "What do you study?" Studying religion. And they said, "Oh, what do you study?" And I said, "New religions." And they wanted to know more. And I said, "Okay, I study UFO religions." And they're like, "Whoa, that's weird." I'm like, "So yes, it's weird, but it's not just weird. It's really interesting, and I think it really tells us about our society." Yes, this is a very niche sort of group, and people are not going to rush off and join these in large numbers. There's never going to be a turn off screen sharing. There's never going to be a the newer UFO religion with tens or hundreds of thousands of members, but they say something really interesting about our time period and about us, and I think that they're worth paying attention to. So that's my spiel. And it's funny. So I appreciate the applause, but when Ted, I know you're on sort of on theology, and much broader. I mean, there's the number of people who would read the Bible and say, well, I want to make sense of how the alien and the extraterrestrial makes sense with the biblical worldview, dwarfs the number of people who would actually join a UFO religion. But in some ways, I don't think that that different of a claim of that I want to make sense of the world, and I want to be happy, and I want to make sure that I have whatever I consider salvation, and in some way I want the extraterrestrial to connect to that. And we live in a universe filled with life, one would claim, if one is a member of these groups. So how do we make sense of that? So there we go.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was really fascinating, and something I knew very little. Well, still don't know a huge. You're clearly scratching the surface. It's really interesting. And I'm sure we've got lots of questions. I know that Emad was writing a few during it.
Yeah, I didn't see the chat because I had it my full screen. So
Emad, do you want to kind of summarize some of your comments / questions for Ben?
Question: when you talk about the esoteric tradition, does that include people like Rene Guénon and traditionalism?
It can. Western esotericism is, again, sort of a constructed tradition. There's almost no one who says I am an esotericist until relatively recently. But I think you can define, if you define it to include those who, traditionalism works. Yeah, short answer your question. You can include almost anyone who claims that there's a secret knowledge baked into society, into culture, that they are pulling up and exploring and sharing more broadly. But if you're talking about the same traditionalist movements I'm thinking of, which come out of sort of Switzerland and Germany and France, and I think it's then yes, I would include them as part of that. Oh, in Brazil too. In Brazil.
These white brothers.
Yeah.
Anything to do with the white man's burden and civilizing mission? Anything?
No, I think it's a really unfortunate term that they used, but my understanding is, now I'm not, I mean, these were white people who came up with the ideas, so perhaps subconsciously, but they are drawing on sort of all the cultural understandings of white equals pure, white equals sort of good. But I mean, that goes back to the transfiguration of Christ. The Greek is leukos, which is the white, basically. So when Christ becomes white is when he's going to heaven. So the Great White Brotherhood is sort of these beings of light. These beings of positive beings. Is it subconsciously sort of racist in its own way? Yeah, maybe, but I wouldn't go that far. I'll have to click those links. Thank you for them. I'm gonna click them in the background, and I'll read them later on. I should say, Ahmad, this is interesting. So we had an author for the Brill Handbook who was going to write on UFO religions within the Muslim world, who dropped out and said, I I simply have too much to do. I can't do this. It was the middle of the pandemic. So actually, so I say in the introduction, I say, this is a big hole in the book. Whoever writes the 10 years from now, when there's another version, someone's going to really have to talk about how, this is a huge religious tradition. And and I know I have Muslim friends who are deeply into ufology. So I know there's at least a couple of Muslim folks who are into sort of what is the connection, but it's not, thank you, there we go. But it's something that I would like to learn more about, because there seem to be relatively few specialists. So I look forward to learning what you have to say too.
I can put links to some of those books in
please do. And I see the comment there about aliens taking the place of angels. Yeah, and of course that's the Jung's famous claim that the alien is simply the technological angel, and this is apropos here. So if you want to take a Jungian approach, people are always looking to what's beyond, and the alien is simply the modern form of that. I pulled that up. I think it was last summer when I was working on the UFO handbook. I wanted to see what Jung actually said, because it's Carl Jung. It's he's often quoted as talking about the alien as simply the technological angel. So I pulled it up to see if that was out of context, and actually it isn't. So it's the way we talk about it is actually took me about 3 days to, my German is so poor. It took me about 3 days to translate, like the 4 or 5 pages that it was in. But I think that the way we tend to talk about Jung's understanding is entirely what he meant us to take from that, which is that, within his model that yes, simply for a modern, it is easier to understand this archetypal sky other as an alien as opposed to an angel, but that is simply what the ancients would have called one word and we another. So I think we're on solid ground quoting Jung there.
Yeah, that leads really nicely on to Robert's question that he's put in the chat. But I'm not sure. Robert said, when did we stop believing in angels and why? And then also fairies. I guess the only thing I would say, just before I hand over to you, Ben, is my understanding is that when they've done surveys, belief in angels is much higher than belief in the traditional religions where belief in angels comes from. So I wonder if we do.
Yeah, I don't think we have. Yeah, and I also, if you know, I mentioned Christopher Partridge's work earlier. He wrote the Re-Enchantment of the West. I think it was a 2-part book about sort of how the claim is often that we moderns don't believe in that anymore. We actually do. And yeah, so the Pew numbers, I know the North American context better, but the Pew numbers certainly show that that people are as likely to claim belief in aliens, or that there's spirits within trees, or that there's ghosts. But everything we would call the religious, the spiritual, the paranormal, it's hard to break them apart in categories, but that we live in a world filled with the non-empirical seems to be a given. For many people. Again, this new group I just started studying, they're very small. And again, they're not going to get big either, but I got into studying them because they call themselves a cult, and few cults do. But the Unicult group, their founder is what they refer to as a starseed, or what we used to call a walk-in. So a starseed is a space alien, an alien consciousness present on Earth to engage in sort of spiritual work in a human body. So their founder claims that they're a starseed. But actually said at one point, but you can call me an angel too, because that's all the angels are. So they just sort of dumped the categories into one. You can look them up if you want. They're called Unicult. They're fascinatingly interesting group, but tiny, 100 people. What did people say? Oh, and you mentioned Prometheus too, and I think that's something I probably should have mentioned too, is pop culture. In some ways, UFO religions are very much responding to pop culture. And the number of UFO religions that imagine or understand or visualize the extraterrestrial in precisely the way in which Close Encounters of the Third Kind does, or exactly the way that the artist for Whitley Strieber's book did, is amazing, right? But on the other hand, I don't want to hold UFO religions to a different sort of standard than other religions. The number of Christians who think that Jesus looks like how Michelangelo painted him is probably pretty high too. So simply the fact that UFO religions read their theology through popular culture is probably not indicative of anything other than that they're a religion. I mean, that's we see that, we see that in all sorts of places. But it is quite interesting that, well, for example, the Heaven's Gate, they had this entire sort of ideology that they were the Luciferian space aliens. So these are the fallen angels who follow Lucifer. But the way they appeared were as lizard-like space aliens inside of human skin suits. So this is in conspiracist. It's also the plot of V, which was a 1980s sort of American, I think, B grade or lower television miniseries. But then it goes. You can also find this in was it David Icke's work as well. So that sort of conspiracist claims. So it's where is it textual? Where is it pop culture? Where is it religious? These lines are really quite hazy. Cargo cults, yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. The cargo, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I would absolutely agree. Yeah, and the place of science and scientism.
Something.
Oh, go on then, Robert. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. What I was actually going to conclude my comment by saying, you won't find many believers in angels and the supernatural in universities, indeed most universities, either amongst staff or amongst students. Educated people, to put it shortly, don't believe in such stuff anymore, whereas back in medieval times, or later than that, early modern times, lots of people did. And my thought was, I'm just about to read Lecky on the rise of rationalism in Europe. And I thought I would be interested to find out when this happened and why it happened. And what are we now to think, given the, I think, extraordinary evidence that the UFO phenomena, the UAP phenomena, is a real one. And it seemed to me that if you put these two ideas together, that we'd stop believing in angels and fairies and such stuff. But it now looks as there's strong evidence, very strong evidence, I think compelling evidence, that such stuff actually exists in the form of UFOs with extraordinary flight characteristics, amazing powers, is really puzzling, really extraordinary, and may have some consequences in terms of religion and so forth. But I haven't really thought very much further about that. But the fact that the evidence seems complete, to me, at any rate, completely compelling, is surprising and puzzling.
Let me think. So first, I would note that, although it's completely anecdotal, among the many educated people that I interact with at colleges, universities, again, primarily in North America, in the US and Canada, although yes, the majority has adopted this sort of secularist, modernist outlook you described, there's a strong minority that has not. However, I would concur that the language they want to use is very rationalist. So while they wish to retain belief in the supernatural and in the magical, they want it to be seen as either a rational belief and therefore entirely sort of separate. Yes, I'm scientific and religious, or they want to have a way to sort of to explain it through the lens of what comes across as sort of philosophically believable claims. You have your cake and eat it too. So I mean, I find it interesting your question, because one could posit therefore that UFO religions would be a good solution to that, because then you really can have religiosity and secularism at the same time. But I think the problem there is the UFO is still stigmatized. The number of people who would say publicly, openly in American universities, a number of faculty and staff, I mean, yes, I believe in extraterrestrials, and yes, I believe in UFOs and visitations, is astronomically slim, because that's stigmatized, that you come across as a crackpot, with very few exceptions. I mean, if you're involved in sort of, psychological studies, maybe. So I guess I understand why you don't find a lot of people clamoring to say, well, I'm going to just join or found a UFO religion, because that's even more stigmatized than simply saying, I believe in the Virgin Mary, and I believe that in miraculous healings and in holy water. I mean, that would mark you as sort of weird, I think. And if you walked into a faculty meeting and said, here's my holy water. On the other hand, if I'm making claims about, Catholic holy water, that's, thousands of years old. People are going to say, okay, yeah, that's fine, but that's, that's old. Whereas if I'm making claims about UFOs, that's stigmatized in a very different way. So, Other questions? I hope that was succinct. I mean, it's a wonderful question, and I'm still sort of thinking it over.
You're muted, Rich.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Well spotted. Good. Just looking in the chat there, Ted. Yes, I will. Yeah, I'll make it available for everybody on the assumption everybody's happy with that here. I do have a question, Ben, but I think you've sort of shown me that there's much more diversity to these movements than I perhaps assumed. So maybe there isn't a single answer to this question, but I guess there's two questions. One is, how do one of the things that has always struck me when watching Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, because we get bits of it over here, is that they're often quite skeptical, cynical, almost a bit sort of mocking of religious claims. So that when they look at the book of Ezekiel and they say, well, there's obviously not angels, so therefore it must be aliens. So with these various groups, how do they feel about mainstream Christianity, mainstream Islam, Judaism? Do they have this similar sort of slightly, or they're not scientific, they're not rational, we are? And then also sort of related to that, how do they feel when they look at these various cults that have ended in mass suicide? Do they recognize themselves in that? Does that give them pause for thought, or do they have ways of explaining, no, they're different to us? A broad question.
So the response is interesting, because actually what you're describing here is the perspective of the creators versus the perspective of the consumers of the popular culture. And I would agree, the creators of the popular culture, the producers of Ancient Aliens and such, yes, are very dismissive of religion and take a very sort of materialistic, secularist, rationalist approach that, yes, clearly Ezekiel wasn't really seeing images. This was, he was crazy, or he was on drugs. And there are claims of simply, you just make out of the blue, if it's weird, they must have been on drugs. You need no evidence. We simply will claim these ancients were simply on drugs, because how else can we explain that they saw this other than mushrooms? We'll just say mushrooms. So there's a sort of the secularist rationalist assumption, but the way it's received, I don't think always follows that. And there certainly are some who would watch it and say, yes, this is evidence, this supports my claim that all religions are BS. But there are many others who watch that and ignore all of that and say, well, when the aliens came to talk to Ezekiel and they revealed to Ezekiel the power of sort of, that the eyes were opal. So that shows me that opal allows you to have healing powers. So if I wear an opal around my neck, or if I powder opal dust and drink it, then that will cure my cancer. So that becomes sort of a way in which this is translated. Did the producer of the show ever want that to be received that way? Certainly not. How did they respond to groups like Heaven's Gates? The example with the suicides. The examples I'm aware of is dismissive, is to say, well, these people are clearly crazy, and simply to other them. And one of the more interesting studies I did as part of Heaven's Gate is I looked at, so the Heaven's Gate suicides took place in Holy Week. So I looked at the response of Christian ministers to the Heaven's Gate suicides. And there were many who simply said, well, this is crazy. It's UFOs, it's suicide, it's crazy. I did run across actually a really interesting editorial from, who it was, but who said, well, actually the reason this is disturbing is how close it is. I mean, that they believe in heaven. They call it the heavens, but they believe in heaven. They believe in salvation. They believe in the Bible. They believe that we are not this body, that we transcend this earth. We transcend, there's something beyond simply this human life. And that's actually disconcertingly close. Yes, the alien stuff is different, but the longing for salvation is disconcertingly close. So I think the othering is a really easy way for us to look at UFO religions and say, well, they're clearly other, they're clearly crazy, they're clearly nuts. Let's make fun of them, as opposed to saying, actually, a lot of people want to make claims about where the people came from and why the earth is the way it is and how we have to take care of the planet and the danger we place ourselves in, and whether I am or I'm not my body, or whether I'm a soul, or whether I have a destiny. I mean, all of these things that religions talk about, we find in UFO religions too. But yes, their immediate response was to say, not us, crazy people. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to jump in with I can see there's some comments there.
I should mention to Ahmad, to the it's interesting, the fallen angel stuff is very, it's Miltonian basically. So actually you can find it in the Midrash as well, but it's interesting to what extent many of the consumers of sort of the fallen angel equals Lucifer equals Satan equals space alien stuff are basically reading Paradise Lost as if that were the Bible, and that's just sort of assumed. So that's a tangent.
Margaret, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I put a note up here that this is exactly an extension of a field in cultural anthropology that studies millenarian movements and cargo cults, things like that. And they've studied groups like this since about the Second World War. And they're all very, very similar. And these are very similar too. The point I wanted to make is about craziness. You know, what looks crazy in one culture may not look crazy in another, and vice versa. In other words, in general, the millenarian movements in cultural anthropology are theorized as a reaction to stress. You know, people come in with these big airplanes, they have all this technology, you know, stress. And the same thing has been even applied to voodoo, people call it. You know, people who are undergoing social stress of upward mobility tend to be more involved with voodoo. So, you know, there's a link between the stuff and stress. And sometimes it looks crazy, but you know, I hesitate to call it crazy because people are people, and people can be stressed beyond limits. People can be stressed far beyond limits and come back. So I very definitely hesitate to calling it crazy. You know, insanity, there's some organic types of insanity. But reactions to stress imposed by a stronger, more powerful, more scientific world. That's what this all is. Yeah, there's people are scared. They're scared to death.
I don't
think it's crazy, is what I'm saying.
I would concur. And when I use the word crazy, I was saying that that's how others would see them. The members of either formal UFO religions or just people who are into sort of religious ufology and not part of a formal group who I've talked to, I would never call them crazy. Yeah, they're eclectic, but we're all eclectic. And I'm not sure where to draw the line. I know people who think that the Virgin Mary talks to them every month. And I'm not sure why I should call that any crazier than someone who says they've talked to a space alien, or someone who feels as if, you know, they could, they can read a sacred text and make sense. But I mean, that's not a secularist claim. It's simply admitting that I don't stand in some sort of ideal objective state where I can claim what's true or not and who's sane or not. They all gain religious value from this.
Well, medical anthropologists have been struggling with this crazy line for decades. You know, there is no good answer. Stress is stress, and anybody who's human being can be pushed over a line to a stressful reaction. So, you know, it's me and you, babe.
I'd like to add something to what Margaret is saying. The stress explanation, we find it in Carl Jung, should be augmented by a hope for salvation in technology.
Yeah.
If we go to 1947, the stress factor is enormous. The bombs have just been dropped. The West is frightened by the Soviet Union, and they're afraid of the new technology. But on the other hand, There, wow, that's the new
Right. They
technology.
want it. They want it.
It would save us if we could only be sure the technology is peaceful. It would give us power and salvation. So I think there are two sides of that coin. On the one hand is stress and fear, but the other is the hope. Technology has the power to save us if we can only turn it for good.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Very
I'm
good.
thinking
Very good point.
Boyer's work about the bombs are light, the sort of the about the sort of the atomic age, the fascination with and the repulsion from, right? So if you don't know that, he's an American intellectual historian, but wrote about sort of simultaneously. You have the like the nuclear drive-ins. You also have though this fear of it's all going to blow up. Yes, it makes perfect sense. Chris, please.
Yeah, that stress rings a bell, and especially because, Ben, you talked about part of this phenomena is the ecology and the environment, and the salvation from that. Obviously, everyone, especially the young, are in fear of what's happening to this planet. And so, this is a way out of that, somewhere to relieve the stress. So much of what one sees, the programs on television, etc., they're kind of trying to have a relief of stress through some superpowers, all these supermen and superwomen. It's, as you say, very much part of that. So, yeah, thank you. And as you say, it's been there all along. I'm thinking of, well, yeah, okay, I had another point concerned with Jill Tarter and her kind of view, but yeah, on.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that we see both sort of some UFO religions very sort of escapist in that sense, and others very sort of much what engaging. I mean, so the Arthurian idea that they could heal the earth through performing religious ritual, or also then I guess you have the Heaven's Gate or idea or the Raelian idea, Heaven's Gate saying, well, let's just leave the earth. Or the Raelian saying someone's going to come fix it, right? So I guess there's your three models, right? Either we'll fix it ourselves, we're going to leave it, and this will sound very Freudian, right? Sort of the daddy figure aliens will come and fix it for us. I mean, again, I don't want to say that all Raelians are basically like closet Freudians, but there is a certain Freudianness to this. We've screwed up our Earth so much, someone's got to come and fix it for us. Just build them a nice place, and they'll come and they'll do it. I mean, there's a certain. I don't know how else to interpret it.
Your three types are very helpful with putting various things. One other person came into mind. It was Jill Tarter, and her idea that if we have contact with aliens, then their religion, as it were, will be so overwhelming as to take over all the religions on the earth. And so maybe that's also part of this, that the religions are sort of seem to work against each other at the moment, and certainly, have been causes of wars, etc. So that's often brought up as an argument against religion. But so if one can have an over-religion, almost as a Mott's overlord, taking over everything, and so, relieving all these factors and stress, etc.
I think actually this is was this talk is part of sort of the end of the science fiction line of the project, right? So I can make a science fiction reference here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That reminds me of. I'm a fan of the science fiction show Babylon 5, which is I know it was mentioned I think in the last talk, but the sort of a little is it mentioned in a couple Babylon 5 episodes is the doctor on that show is part of a religion called Foundationism, which is a reference to Asimov also, but it's but the religion of Foundationism within Babylon 5 is that the aliens have contacted Earth, and the foundation within Babylon 5 is the attempt to sort of pull all the knowledge from all of the universe's religions and put them together and come to the eternal truth. But the idea of it's sort of like Unitarianism in outer space. But I've always loved it as sort of a model. My wife was Unitarian, I can make that claim. So it's the but you can pull from everything. But I've always loved that the JMS, the creator of Babylon 5, although a secularist and an atheist or agnostic, put that in, that sort of that there's the idea that in the future, after aliens contact us, that there'll be some sort of new religious consciousness, and that foundationism within Babylon 5 is that. And it's only mentioned about 4 times in the show, but I always like it when it is.
Thank you, Ben. I'm absolutely happy for everybody to keep talking. I actually need to go. So what I can do is I will say goodbye to our YouTube viewers, and then if you want, I can make Ben the host, and you can keep chatting, and then just disperse as and when you're ready. Are you happy with that? Yeah.
Yes, I was just checking my text messages to make sure I didn't have to do anything. My children are at camp, so it's the morning over here in Chicago. So, but they're all fine. So I can talk for a few more minutes, but then I have to go and start more of my day because we're just starting.
Excellent. Well, let me just say again, thank you, Ben, for that fascinating talk. I learned a lot, and I hope that all of our YouTube viewers did. And to our YouTube viewers, I hope that you'll like the video and subscribe. And if you're interested in getting more videos like this, again, I'll upload them to our YouTube channel. Or if you go to www.rax.org, you can find our website, and there's an email form over there where you can sign up to be on our mailing list if you want to listen to some of these talks live. But until next time, then, take care. All right. Bye.